Welcome, everybody. I'm glad you're all here. I would like to call to order the school board work session on finance. Today's date is January 11th. So with that brief introduction, I would tell the audience that one of our members, Sarah Stivlin, is not able to be here in person, but her image is with us, and hopefully all communications will go well, so she'll be an active participant with us as well. In addition to that, it appears all our members are here and staff as well. So thanks everybody for joining us. So with that, I'll turn it over to Superintendent Bontrelli, and she'll give us a little background on that.
Great, thank you. So for your agenda, it's fairly brief, but what we'd like to do first is bring you back through the budget assumptions and projections for this year. And as a reminder for the community and for the board and new board members that our Budget Adjustment Committee is just that, a committee made up of teachers, principals, district administration, community members, and board members who come together to make assumptions about what might happen with finance as regarding to the education in the district overall, based on a lot of emerging influences that are happening at the state and local level. And this process has been in place for some time. We've gotten better and better. As the board knows, our projections, we came within about $300,000 in a $100+ million budget. That's pretty good. And so the process has been refined over time. And part of that is really thanks to our employee groups who've worked with us to have a better understanding of what those budget assumptions are, how they impact the decisions we make. Our staff and our negotiations committee for the SCA have spent and other union groups have spent a lot of time, investment of time and education and learning more about what the process is. So the more we learn, the better understanding we have together, the closer we've been able to come on those projections. So just a reminder that today the budget assumptions that we will be going through with you was created by a committee, but it is always the board's prerogative to look at that and say no. A different time, different people around the table, we have different ideas of what that might look like. That is really what we base our work on. It's not one person making those decisions, it's a committee that pulls that together. Then we'll remind the board of the approved reductions that you've already made and how that impacts the budget, and give you some projections to look at. And then finally, the board will have the opportunity to talk about what are our next steps. And those are options that we've talked about before, either remains the same, do nothing else, and use some of your fund balance or your savings to be able to pay for some of the additional costs, or you can cut to balance the budget, or you can go deeper to start looking at the fund balance. Those are all choices that you have to make as we move forward. So with that, what I'd like to do is have Director Hoheisel begin and go through the budget assumptions that the committee created in November, and just make sure that everybody is up to speed on those budget assumptions. After she does that, then we'll show you how that's impacted our budget moving forward. And then probably after that is the best time to ask questions, because then you might say, well, if we made this adjustment in our assumptions, what might that mean for our overall budget? All right? All right, I'll turn it over to Director Hoheisel.
Thank you and good afternoon. I'm going to apologize because I'm going to be looking down when I'm inclined to look up to speak to all of you, but I do need to read the material in front of me. One other thing that I'd actually like to preface this presentation with is not only did that committee do the work and completed their work in about early to mid-November, other factors that have come into play as we look at revised numbers is the revised budget that was approved by the school board December 20th, I believe, maybe the 20th. And so the revised budget, and then it was also the levy. When the levy was approved in December, those numbers now impact the 19-20 school year. So we have three different sources of information that created updated numbers. So when it comes into question of, why, good, bad, or otherwise, why wasn't this brought before? Why didn't we know? Because things are done at points of time. It is a budget, it is a projection, and as soon as something that is material, quite large, whether it be the levy or a revised budget comes to fruition and approved, that's typically when we provide an update to the board to give you a fresh look at the most recent numbers that we have. So I will move into the budget assumptions for, and this is the 19-20 school year through the 21-22 school year. Please recognize that the farther out you get, and the reason why we do 3 years is the farther out you get, the more unreliable the numbers become. There's different factors that come into play, which are enrollment and state aid and contracts, and there's just not a lot of teeth once you get beyond 3 years as far as predictability of what our financial forecast will look like. As far as the revenue components on the budget assumptions, the committee looked and said, what do we think is going to happen in enrollment projections? And they believed that we would see a slight increase next year, and at the time it was about 30 students, which brought us to 8,300, and that we would at least remain consistent with that population. So it was, moving forward, let's just assume we're going to have 8,300 students attend the district. We have no anticipation of us declining. We might grow, but 8,300 is the number that we want to look at. We also said that we believe that we'll get money from the state of Minnesota. This next year, it will be 2% and 2% on our general education formula, and then 1.5% year 3. Just a note that 2% on the state's general education formula is about $1 million a year. So any variation with that, if the state were to come back and give us 3, you're looking at $500,000. If we were to get less, that can be the swing in our budget as the legislative process moves forward. Years ago, we had, when the state was working through their budgets and experienced deficits, they started playing with the timing of when they would give schools their money, and which was called a shift of when we'd receive it. We anticipate nothing of that happening at the state level in the next 3 years. Now we get into a couple of categorical components of types of revenue we receive. Literacy incentive aid, we're assuming at $430,000 a year. That's usually in the $400,000 category. And what literacy incentive aid is, it takes into account your reading scores in 3rd and 4th grade, and there's a growth factor component, and you get a % of money based on the culmination of that information. We believe our compensatory revenue will decrease to $700,000. Again, I want to say we've been in the range of $725 to $750 on any given year. We believe that might slightly go down. We believe that there will be no changes in referendum for the next 3 years. Special ed funding increases $200,000 a year to allow for potential growth in formula. We are at a cap. The state has allowed a growth factor, but we're assuming that we're just going to go with a flat $200,000 increase in each year in revenue above what we currently receive. Status quo on Q-Comp, which means that we will continue to receive aid for Q-Comp, but we will not levy for Q-Comp. And then other formula-driven revenues will follow the general education formula. So there's other formula-driven revenues would be things such as gifted and talented. If they're linked to the gen ed formula and the gen ed formula gets 2%, that too will be adjusted. There's different components throughout our revenue streams that follow the general education formula. And then no changes to miscellaneous revenue. We're essentially saying if we receive so much money in gate, meaning attendance at a football game for a season, we're just going to hold that flat. There's not enough variation there to see any significant increase or decrease. That's the revenue side. As we work through the expenditures, we assumed that contracts will have a 0% increase. And again, the board and the bargaining groups make decisions when they get to the table. So that's why we assumed nothing, but we did say that there would be steps and lanes, which equal approximately $1 million. Somewhere between $800,000 and $1 million, put in $1 million saying everybody's going to advance through their respective salary schedules and their bargaining agreements, but we're not going to presume anybody gets anything additional beyond that. And then when identifying health insurance and dental insurance, we're saying this is what the district contribution is going to go. It's not what the percent of health insurance as a whole is going to go, it's just what are we going to contribute that goes up. And we assumed 3.5% each year for health insurance and then 1% each year for dental. OPEB trust payment, $1 million annually, so we have 2 mechanics in place to pay for OPEB now. This year will be, 1920 will be our first year. We draw money from a trust. We have $8 million left in that trust, and we draw $1 million to support, and OPEB is other post-employment benefits. So think like retiree health insurance. We draw down from the trust, and we used to be drawing down from the general fund, and now this last levy cycle that was approved in December, we're actually levying for what the general fund was paying. So we take a drawdown from the trust, and now we're actually going to levy for the difference, so it relieved the impact to the general fund. Staff development will remain at 2%. Again, now I know the board has adopted that there would be a reduction in staff development, but this is the criteria of the set aside from the state of Minnesota has to be 2%. We're not changing the criteria from the state of Minnesota. How we do it internally, we have adjusted, but we're not, that's what we believe will continue to be the criteria from the state. Transportation costs increase by 2.25% for 1920, 2.75% for 2021, and then 2.75% again for 21-22. I will say this, the 2.25% is the last year of our contract with Minnesota Central, so we know that percentage to be exact. We assume that 15 retirees will happen at the end of this year, and the difference between what we're paying for that staff to leave or at their current salary and a new staff to be hired, which is you presume it's going to be less. We're assuming that the difference between those is $25,000 per person. And then we set aside money for severance, and we're making adjustments there, $495,000 in 1920, $400,000 in 2021, and then $227,000 in 21-22. This is back almost 2 decades ago. To do OPEB and do different things, you had to sunset payments, and so we're slowly expiring the people that are eligible for a severance payment when they retire from the district. So eventually this will not be a payment for us. And then we're assuming 4.5% increase in utilities, 5% increase in property and liability insurance, and 2% increase in workers' compensation each year. And the final assumption was supplies and materials will increase by 2%. This was removed by board action December 21st, and so it was also moved from the projection model because we know that to be true again, at least at least for what the information that's presented to you. Moving on to the next page. So now when you're looking, and I forgot my cheat sheet of numbers, of course. When you're looking at, okay, where does that leave us, Kristen? In absence of any board action, so let's just pretend the board didn't do anything in December. What is the difference between 4.48927, which is what essentially $4.5 million, which is what we're projecting in our unassigned ending fund balance to be this year. And with the new assumptions and levy and budget, what do we believe the difference is? And you can see that's now believe we would end if you did nothing at 2.664. So you're talking about $1.8 million. So we were talking 2.5 when the conversation started, when we were using numbers from last year. And now we're down to 1.8. And essentially the reasons are, we are, and again, there's nuances. You have different, we have actual staff in as opposed to projected, but essentially your big outliers are, we assumed a year ago that we would have a 1.5% increase in gen ed formula. Now we're assuming 2. So when you go up 0.5%, you are talking $500,000. We are assuming Things we know. We currently now have a new cell tower in place, a new cell tower agreement going in at J.C. Fields. That was $26,000. We now own a bus garage, of which we will receive rental income, and we anticipate the net effect from the rental income less the operating expenses to be about $160,000, no, 140, excuse me.
Net, is that net?
Net,
Okay.
yeah, the rental income in and of itself is $200,000.
Okay.
And then we have the levy for OPEB. So where we were taking that out of the general fund before, we're now we are now set up to levy for it. So those are some revenue components that help drop that number, or change that number. Again, if we didn't get 2% from the state of Minnesota, that alters it. But why is there a difference? That's why. When you look out to 21 and 22, you can see the trajectory if we didn't make changes. I would caution you to go to 23 and 24 because, again, the committee doesn't even discuss it because you're just so far out at that time that they're not reliable. So just assume you're looking at, 19 is where we're at with the revised budget. You're looking at 20, 21, and 22. That's what we've discussed, and you can see where our trajectory is. I'll ask you to turn to the next page. And this is maybe a different way to look at it. It depends on your approach. When you look and say, okay, now we have a fund balance goal. And what would it take for us to get back up to the 5%? And right now, we're projecting to end this year at just better than $1.2 million below our goal. Like if you were going to make adjustments to the budget, that would get us to goal. As you look at next year, again, in absence of any board changes, and we do have board changes, you'll see that in the next slide, we'd be looking at about $3 million to get to board goals. So if the board did nothing, this is the trajectory of how you would carry on the difference between the board fund balance policy and where we actually lie. So it's just a different way to look at it. It's not talking about balancing your budget. It's talking about where would you need to be to get to your goal. Okay? Now the following page, and I'm going to go past this one pretty quickly, but this is just a summary of the action that was taken by the board and approved on the 21st. And you can see that's $1.081 million. Just a reminder. The next page after that is the projection now, which is essentially the same projection of what you just saw, but with those changes. So currently, again, projected to be at 4.48 million. Now, with the adjustments and all of the new assumptions and factors that have come into play, we're saying we anticipate being around 3.75, which means your difference falls in the range of about $750,000. So if you're looking to cut to balance your budget, there's about $750,000 that you have left to do that work. And again, you can see once the adjustments were made, it helps in 21, and it also helps in 22 as you move forward. Those numbers aren't lower because you stop the ongoing expenses and the compounding expenses, so those numbers adjust as well. And then the last slide, or the last graph part of the presentation, you can see now this is where we're at based on how far away are we from the board goal. And instead of $3 million, we're now at essentially $1.9 million. So, board considerations, which is your very last page. When looking at these numbers, and essentially the focus then becomes the last two pages, you can do nothing moving forward and just spend down the fund balance. You can cut the $735,435 to balance. You can say our revenues equal our expenses and we're good with that. You can cut the and I'll round, the 1.19 million to meet your fund balance goal. Or you can do quite honestly, anything you choose. You can do a combination. You can pick a number in between. You can go greater than if there's other initiatives. There's, the possibilities of how you put this together are yours to determine, but just to provide you an update and then have the conversation on what that looks like going forward.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
It's a lot of work, but I think it helps. What I'd like to do, and if everybody's in agreement, is first of all, make sure we understand things on the slides. So maybe what we'll do is go to that first page, and I'll go around and see if any board members have questions on what you're looking at or interpretations. Then we'll go to page 2, and we'll go through that way. And then once we've done that, then we can open discussions in some of the questions that Kristen has phrased for us. So first of all, perhaps going to slide 1, are there any questions?
Yeah.
Director?
So when do
Yes.
we actually find out for sure what we do get from the state?
When the legislative session closes, I believe the date is May 23rd. And if they go, and I'm just, maybe through the years have grown to be a bit cautious with using that date because they tend to extend the session. So I would say the best estimate is the end of May and possibly the beginning of June.
Okay, thank you.
And what I would say, and Tina and I come out of a C meeting today, and we had a senator there and a representative there. It's in the Constitution, it's such and date. And what the legislature is in the habit of doing is using every minute of that time. So a lot of times they settle in the wee hours. Other questions? Page 1.
I do have a question on page 1 about Q-Comp. If you can explain to me and any other board members about what that means. You said that we currently receive state aid, but we do not levy for that. Could you explain that?
Yes. So there is and it's slightly less than just because of the veto from Governor Dayton last year, but I'm going to use round numbers of because people got reduced because budgets didn't get increased. But $260 went into play when Q-Comp went into play during the Palenti administration. They said you have $260 per is it student or ADM available to you to implement this program. Of that money, is it 161 or 169 is aid? But guess what? Your local community has to have some skin in the game. So then you have to do the levy. Fine, we'll give you the aid, but you also have the ability to levy for the difference to get you up to that $260. So we do the aid piece and we collect the 160 whatever on our students. We don't, as a district, and I want to say it's $69 for the levy, we don't collect that. We have an opportunity to. There was actually a considerable amount of discussion by the board last spring on whether we wanted to. It was the decision not to move forward with the levy piece. We will probably be having that conversation again this spring, but that's why I say there's a differentiation there.
And Kristen, if we decided to do that, that would be 69 times 8,300 kids.
Yes.
Which is
So-
570,000.
Okay, and just so I can clarify, you said approximately, we initially used the number $260 per student. You said about $160
I want to say it's 161 is aid and then 69 is levy. Does that equal?
Was it 191?
191 and then
91.
69. Yes,
Okay.
that's it.
191.
Okay.
Just to clarify, that's not, when even if you levy or don't levy for it, that's not money that just goes into your general fund, right? It's part of an approved plan. It's not money that can be used to supplant something that's already going on. So it's a different revenue stream to do different stuff, additional stuff. It's not a revenue stream to take the place of what you're spending on.
So it's not unassigned.
It's not unassigned dollars, so that, just to be clear about that.
Sometimes it bumps something.
Yeah, and thank you. And could you explain how it is currently being used? How those dollars are currently being employed?
Sure. Kathy can help me if I miss it, but the agreement that we have now funds a Q-Comp lead teacher. It funds 4 instructional coaches. It funds, and those are considered steps or career ladder parts to the plan, which is a requirement. And then there's an incentive piece based on a teacher's completion of our teacher evaluation and growth development process. And then the other part of it that gets paid is some committee work and professional development support, for example, our mentoring program and things of that nature.
So there are requirements that the district has to fulfill in order to obtain just the aid dollars, correct?
Correct. The plan, you become eligible for those dollars based upon MDE's acceptance of your QComp plan.
Which is, did you say already who it's put together by? That
It gets put together by the QComp working group, so there's a QComp board that meets, and then when it was initially put into place, that group meets and comes up with a plan that is agreeable both by the school board and the teachers union.
So if the district decided they wanted to pass a non-voter approved levy in this case, and they were going to do it for QCOM, and they got money, which we said 570,000 or so, that would go into QCOM spending.
Correct.
And not into offset, say, the fund balance.
Correct.
Okay. Does that help?
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
Other questions on page 1?
Yep. The literacy incentive aid of 430,000, is that something that we can get even if our reading scores decrease? How do you get that?
Yeah, again, it's the scores with a growth component percentage in there. So I think if our growth didn't exist, my guess it would be reflective then in the dollar amount that we actually receive. So if it's not just the scores, our score, no, I mean, I suppose you can't get all your scores to go down and then show a growth component. That's counterintuitive. But those are the two factors that come into play in the formula.
It always strikes me as odd, and I hate to editorialize, that you get punished if your kids don't do well, as opposed to the kids need more help.
Well, and I think if you were to look, and when this aid component came into play, I think it was, we want you, the state of Minnesota wants to focus your efforts on reading, and we will reward you for it. And so their way of rewarding you is to show, here are our scores, here's growth, here are our scores, here's growth, and that as long as those efforts continue to be put into that, they will continue to give some form of compensation for it.
Thank you. Liz,
Yes, thank you.
any other questions on page 1?
I have a question. Yes, hi, thanks. Is the OPEB levy listed in this revenue sheet anywhere?
The OPEB levy is reflective on the totals, like when you get to the dollar amount where that lies. The OPEB levy, as far as the assumption, does it adjust any of our assumptions moving forward? No, it's now included, and we're going to do it in the next 3 years. Does that make sense, Sarah?
It is listed under expenditures on the second page.
No, that's the use of the trust.
Oh, I
Right,
didn't
the
understand.
expenditures sheet just shows using funds out of the trust, but we levied for OPEB the additional revenue that should be on this sheet.
Well, we're already, now, because of the discussion and the implementation of the levy this past year, we're now just assuming that carries forward. So it's built into the model, but we don't assume, what the assumption would be is, dear committee, do you believe that the board will no longer levy for OPEB? Then we would do a reduction of the dollar amount that we believe is going to be levied. Status quo is again, it's no changes in referendums. I would actually include, it's a verbiage, there's no changes in referendum and that levy and those levies. Like kind of the things that are in place will stay in place.
Okay, so you're saying it already existed before this adjustment right now? So it's not a change?
Correct, it currently exists.
Okay.
But I think, Director Stivlin, to your point, what she's saying is if you, maybe the language of no change in referendums, we can put referendum / levy so that your OPEB piece is reflected.
Oh, there we go.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
And it might say not only levied, but OPEB.
Okay, this is my last one on this page. sorry.
You can have as many as you want.
The one says decrease in compensatory revenue to 700,000 for each year. What was it previously?
Again, I believe we were falling somewhere between 725 and 750. I just saw a report that came out yesterday, and I'll be doggoned if I can remember the dollar amount, but it was better than 700, but it was probably no more than 20,000 better than 700. So there might be, back to, okay, this was a point in time, that's what they assumed.
Thank you.
They might be a little different in actuality.
And what is compensatory aid?
So compensatory aid is based off of your, essentially your free and reduced population. It's based off of your English language learners.
Okay.
I think that's it. Oh, that's the basic. Compensatory is just the free and reduced. The basic skills is your, also your EL learners, but this is just essentially saying that in our free and reduced population or concentration, we typically run around 15%. And we're just saying, you know, we believe that our socioeconomic status probably isn't going to change that much.
So in those dollars can be used in any way we wish, or are they assigned?
They're assigned.
They're assigned. This is the same thing that's usually referred to as Title I funds.
Okay.
No,
No?
basic
Basic
skills.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
And we use it, you know, there's, you know, you want to direct it towards the population of need,
Right.
the ones that have been identified. Title I is, let's go this way, Mike, to expand on your statement, not taken as a question. Compensatory helps drive our Title I funding.
Gotcha.
Okay.
Other questions on slide 1? Can we turn the page? I remember reading this book, don't turn the page. Questions on that page, second page? Jennifer?
Just an easy one here. For clarification, the steps and lanes increase there. So that is not the entirety of the population that receives contracts. That's, so that does leave out those who do not acquire a step or a lane in that contractual.
And if we could, just for the sake of audience, non-educators, tell them what steps and lanes are.
Sure. So in employee contracts, there is essentially a system designed, and again, it's not necessarily all contract, maybe it is in our district that every contract has a step and lane increment. The lane is associated with educational components. So I started out and I have a BS degree, or I'm a teacher, you know, and then I move on and now I have 15 more credits. And so there's what's written into contracts is there's essentially a system designed to acknowledge that you've continued on with education and have advanced your degree. Can go up to master's, can go up to master's plus so many credits, can go up to a PhD. So those are lanes. And usually that's only affiliated with a teacher's contract. Then the steps are for each year of service, or it might be each year of service, it might be defined differently in each contract, but for a year of service, you move to the next step. There's recognition in a longevity factor. You're not new anymore, you know what you're doing, you're going to get a slightly higher scale of pay, so you step through this until it caps. In some contracts, it's 5 stepping points. So you might get 5 years of advancing, and then you're just held, that's the last step you can take, that's where you are. Teacher's contract has more steps, but nonetheless, eventually you will come to a point where there's no movement left. So when you're calculating, let's say we have an employee that makes, you know, $10,000, and next year they're going to make 12 just because they're here another year. They take another step, they move down. Well, that's a $2,000 increase to over what we're compensating them this year. For all employees in the district, the assumption is, and this is all employees, the assumption is that there will be, and again, we use $800,000 to $1 million of expense of that movement that happens within our district in the general fund. That's just a natural movement.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Thank you,
You're
Mike. Okay, so is it safe to say that, is this all contracts, so our teachers as well as our custodial staff, for example? So then is it safe to make that next assumption that custodial staff probably enjoys less of the steps and lanes than teaching staff, or no?
They don't have as many.
Okay.
Like I say, I want to say they're at 5, maybe 6.
Depending on the position in the custodial unit, there's one classification.
Mike.
One of the classifications has 11 steps, and one of them has a base rate. So it depends on the position. Our other bargaining groups are mostly 5.
Okay.
And then teachers have 22.
Okay, thank
And
you.
Contracts, are there 7 contracts that are up this year?
Yes.
Approximately, because that tells you the scope of.
Yeah.
Other questions on this page, Mark?
Just one on, now, OPEB. There was a levy passed by the board in 2018. What is that amount? You said that in terms of dollars that's coming in, you said that we have a trust draw of
$1
$1
million
million per year. So now how much is that levy taking care of that?
The total expense, and again, it varies depending on the year. What will be before you in the next handful of months is a new actuarial study that tells you what they believe the trajectory is of those expenses. But I would say we have ranged between $1.5 million to $2 million of total expense. Okay? Again, on any given year, as our population ages out, the people that were entitled to this benefit, eventually that will draw down. Again, what comes into play is not only, the calculations, what come into play is not only what we pay, but kind of what having retirees on our plan, how much that adjusts our premium. A lot of formulas that come into play. So back to the question of, let's assume in time we've gone between $1.5 million and $2 million. And we've drawn different money from the trust that was issued a decade ago, and that trust was issued for just over 20 million. We've, taken $1.5 million. We've done different dollar amounts, but we've kind of held at $1 million every year of taking from this trust, which means the general fund absorbs the difference, whether it's 500,000, 700,000, $1 million. With the levy, and I want to say the levy that we put into place on that line was 770 some odd thousand. That's, if you go back and look at the levy presentation, you can see that. That levy will then support the difference. So this is just saying this is what we're drawing up from the trust, and the trust is going to expire soon, which means we're going to have a gap of $1 million once that trust expires, whether we go for levy, again, there's different mechanics that we can get there to cover, but there's going to be an expense that the trust will no longer exist. So we have to figure out how to cover. This is addressing what's coming from the trust. The levy now addresses what once came from the general fund. So we look in the general fund like we're nothing because we're using different mechanics to address it.
Got it.
When does the
Thanks.
trust expire?
Depends on the use, depends on the interest rate. I want to say, again, if we're at 8 million, so next year we're at 7, if you just honestly, Liz, if you assume that, we've got 8 years starting now.
Okay.
That might be optimistic. There might be different things, but I've always kind of thought, boy, we can anticipate that trust expiring 23, 24. You definitely have to have a plan in place by then of how you're going to address that. We do have a few years left, though.
Thank you.
Other questions? Under projected retirees, and it says estimated 15, and then it's estimated cost, because typically, getting back to our steps and lanes, you're gonna hire somebody less. The 25,000, does that represent the cost of a position? In other words, both salary and benefits? That's what goes in that?
No, because the assumption would be that the person that is retiring will still be taking benefits and there will still be some contribution. It would be more along the lines of if you have a current teacher that's making $65,000, we'll probably hire a new teacher to replace them at 40.
Okay. So it really is strictly salary. Thank you. Anything else on slide 2? We get to turn the page again. And this is the projected fund, unassigned fund balance. Questions on this page?
I have one question. So you said the number remaining is 1.8 million. After, is that between, that's between what we will be at the end of 2019 and the end of 2020, not to get us all the way back, correct?
Correct.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Turn the page again, please, and we're on slide 4 or page 4. And our goal of what we're seeking to attain, according to our policy, is 5%. And so that's what this represents, how much typically we'd have to make up. Is that accurate?
That's accurate.
And our last levy year is 2022, right? That's the last year we'll receive funds on the levy.
For the
correct?
operating, yes.
Right.
And that's why it's not reflective, because we only did it out to 22. If I were, now next year when I'm in front of you doing this, then it's going to be honestly a committee conversation and probably a school board conversation of, is that a fair assumption?
And remember that slide 4 doesn't reflect any of the things that you did on the 21st, as far as approving.
Any other questions on slide 4, page 4? We'll turn the page again. And we have the second item on our agenda, and that's approved reductions. Any questions on anything that's listed there?
I have a question. If we approve, oh, you're saying these are approved reductions, you're not saying we have to do anything?
Correct.
So if we want to add to or change anything, is that an option today?
You can have the discussion today, but obviously the decision would have to be at a school board meeting. But yes, that's correct, and that's kind of the last page about what your next steps are. I think the board needs to decide where do we want to land, and then we can figure out the best way to get there.
I do have a question about the first line, the first entry where it says reduce professional development and curriculum budgets by $250,000 each. We do have a requirement, a state requirement of 2%, right, of the state aid has to be assigned towards professional development. How does this reduction impact that requirement that we have?
I think correction, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think this is 2% of the budget, or is it 2% of what the state gives us?
2% gen ed aid is the requirement, which falls between $1 million and $1.1 million, depending on our kids and all of that. But assume about 1.1 million is what we're required to use of our gen ed aid for PD. Which we do. We actually use far beyond that, and so that's when I'll let Bob
Yeah, I think
piggyback
that's what
into
your
that.
question is.
It
So-
won't impact it.
Well, it will, it'll.
It won't
The
impact the
2%.
requirement.
The question was, does it impact the
Right.
2%? It does not impact the 2%.
Because we easily meet the 2%.
Surpass that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Other questions on this page? If not, let's go to page 6. Shelley?
Just, not a question, but just, when I first looked at this, I thought it looks exactly the same. But it's because we stretched out the numbers, so just so everybody recognizes that. It's better, but doesn't quite get us there yet.
I have a question about this. Can you guys hear me okay?
Go ahead.
Okay, good. Yeah, I was gonna say the same thing, Shelley. I'm glad you said that because it's a different scale on the side. So the two lines from the one from before, and this one looked the same, but this one supposedly is supposed to look better. But can you just clarify, Kristen, is this sort of dire depiction essentially trying to show that if we don't have a balanced budget, this is what an unbalanced budget would do, compounding over time? Is that the main thing that this is showing? Because it looks really awful, but I mean, I think you said this earlier, we shouldn't really look at this so far out into the future.
Right, I'd strongly advise that you don't look past 22, to be honest with you.
Right.
That said, when you look at it, this model, and again, I can update and keep providing as often as you would like, that what this does is this just shows if you, and again, choose what you want to do. If you were to not balance your budget, this is kind of the course you're on, right? This is what you're going to continue to look like. Should you balance your budget, or the closer you get to balancing the budget, obviously the years as you move out, because you're right, it's a compounding thing. The more action you take up front, it saves different action as you move down the road. Yes.
Okay.
And I think the challenge also, Sarah, to your question, is on a 8.5 by 11 piece of paper, when you try to put the data points, for the first one, without any board action, which you've already taken some, it does dive pretty quickly. And so I appreciate what you say about it's difficult to kind of have those exactly the same unless we maybe would use a larger graph or something for you. It's accurate.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Kristen, if I may, first of all, fund balance is sort of our savings account. What I'm after here at this point, if you would talk to, and other people can add to that or not, is that our goal is a 5% fund balance. If we don't meet that, what are the ramifications, and why do you have a fund balance in the first place? Kind of those questions, kind of a pro and con.
Sure. As far as what are the ramifications, you're your own police on policy. If you haven't met your policy and you say we're okay with not meeting our policy, then that's by all means your choice to make. The kind of untold or unseen ramifications are, one would be, should we be issuing debt or going out, we need to do something, we need to do a project. Our rating, because you get, the better your credit score is, your personal credit score, the better interest rates you get. Those rules apply to school districts as well. So the farther away you are from kind of the cost of operation and how you're able to meet that is your credit score. And if we had to take out debt for any reason, back in the day, we used to have to issue certificates just to operate because the state wasn't funding us, and it was a timing thing. That's going to affect your interest rates, which ultimately could have a longer-term financial consequence for you. That's one of the implications. Another one is as far as the fund balance goes, and there's been lots of conversations since I've been in the district about fund balance and what that goal should be. It is your rainy day fund. The fund balance shouldn't, and I'm merely speaking from my opinion, it's a savings account, but we're not a bank, right? We're not here to withhold anything that we can provide to students just so we have money in an account. That said, things happen. In the event you have a dip in a year, or you want to do some programming, it levels out kind of the anticipation of what we get from the state. So maybe we were thinking we would get 2% and we got nothing. Okay, we have fund balance there that can help support maybe the adjustments we didn't make because we thought it would look different. It levels out the peaks and the valleys of school funding, state funding, levying, all of that comes into play and helps you, so it's not, we're gonna cut this much this year, we don't have anything, and oh my gosh, now we're gonna add because we just got federal money and let's add, and then the following year we're gonna have to cut $3 million. That's not great for a school district to have those peaks and valleys. You want, your staff to feel comfortable, you want your parents to feel comfortable, you certainly want to set a standard for your students. And so that, to me, is kind of where the fund balance comes in, is levy or to plateau out those peaks and valleys and provide you opportunity, and not put you in a precarious financial position as it relates to potential interest costs and different things moving forward.
And part of it as well is cash flow.
It is.
And if you're short on cash flow, then you gotta go out in the market and borrow. And there is a cost to borrowing.
Yes.
And part of it, you really touched on already, and that's kind of a rainy day for the unforeseen issues that might or might not occur.
Unfortunately, there's a large part of our funding that we don't control. We just don't control. So you have to plan accordingly without, and my recommendation would be, obviously, you don't want 20% sitting in fund balance too, because you have opportunities to do things that you're not doing if that's the case.
It's interesting because schools vary on this. Sarah and I know because we were talking to a fellow board member at a school district that will not be known, and we asked her what her fund balance was. And she didn't know, but she said, I'll find out and let you know. Well, I was at 916 last night, and she told me. And by most people's reckoning, it was huge. And then you go into precisely what you talk about, and that is some people will go to the point then and say, well, why are you functioning as a bank then if you don't need that money? And it was a huge amount.
Well, and each district presents their own, their own situations too. I go back to my former district, and that district very much relied on open enrollment. Well, if something were to happen, whether it be legislatively or with a decision that we're not going to have open enrollment, you're going to need 20%. I mean, different school districts present reasons why their fund balance might look different. I'm just speaking holistically, and certainly a specific, we're here for Stillwater, why we do what we do, or at least what I've seen so far.
Let me ask you a question, or I'm sorry. Last one. Your colleagues, other school districts, is 5% typical, is 10% typical?
It's closer to 10.
Yeah.
We're pretty, our experiences, or our policy is pretty low compared to my colleagues.
Yeah, 916's budget is, our fund balance is much higher. It's about 12%. But there's one key difference. They cannot levy if they run short. We have that power.
Well, and precisely to my point, there's reasons why in each individual district it can look differently because different things come into play.
Thank you. Other questions?
One thing I'd like to point out, because the natural inclination is to say, if you were to look at the chart with the blue and the difference in to get to board goal.
Page 7.
Well, it's page 7 and page 4. You're going to look and say, well, Kristen, this says 3 million to get to board goal in 2020. And once we made $1.81 million in cuts, why isn't that not the exact difference? Because intuitively, you want to believe that it should be. 5% goal is based off of 5% of expenditures. And so as soon as you make adjustments and your expenditures change, that 5% changes. So you're not going to see, you will see a direct correlation of the 1.081 million on the other graph, but you won't see it when you're looking at the 5% fund balance, and that's why.
Other thoughts, comments? If not, let's turn the page, and that's next steps or board considerations. Your thoughts?
I think we need to continue to cut. Oh, sorry.
Again, we remind the chair and others, try to speak to the microphone if you would. Thank you, Liz. Other comments anybody else wishes to make? Shelley?
I agree. I really want us to work to get back to that 5%, whether it's in 1 year, it takes us a little longer. I'm not comfortable with being under that red line at all.
And I think one thing that does show up here is that if you don't meet it this year and then the following year, that it compounds itself and it actually becomes more difficult. Any dissent or questions or other commentary people want to make? All right. So collectively, how do we get there? Thoughts?
Well, sorry. Some of the documents that we got recently talked about the increase in administrative costs over the last 4 years. The first document I think we got at the first finance meeting, which showed changes in director level staffing for a total increase in salary and benefits of $673,101. And then I had asked for changes in coordinator positions. It had some other titles too. And then the information that I got showed in the last 4 years, that increased $752,820. So I think one of the ways that we could save money is, I know that the previous board voted for restructuring and an admin about $200,000, but I think we could easily, because the total of those two is $1,425,921 in 4 years. And I think we could add to that. So I think we could add to about $750,000.
Okay. So if I hear you.
Increase it to $750,000.
So if I hear you correctly, and I think that's kind of what our process is what you're saying is to look, if we're making a list for consideration.
Right.
And that may be, you're asking us to look more deeply at administration,
Yes.
supervisors, and directors?
Yes.
Other comments? Jennifer?
So, yeah, I know this has come up multiple times, so can you speak a little bit more to that, the impact of that, what that would look like? That.
Kathy, do you want to respond to, I think,
This one.
yeah.
Tia, would you pass that around? We didn't get it right
This
here.
is just a hard copy of what we sent to you electronically, so it's not it's what you've gotten previously.
Yeah. So the line item in the budget that we were working from was the coordinator, supervisor, specialist, and tech support. So that's a combination of all of those groups, not just coordinators and supervisors.
Right.
So those positions where you see the increases is all of those positions. In the document that I sent last night electronically, if you look at the highlighting, you had asked where's the difference in the 11 positions, which is the net of those 3 years, the increases and decreases.
Right.
If you look at the different positions, for example, if you follow the blue, the majority of those positions are not increases in coordinators. Those are almost all clerical support type positions. There are a few coordinators. You'll see on the second page, we've got 3 that are community ed coordinator level positions, which come out of a different budget, so that's not impacting your general fund. On the third page, you have you'll see that there's a health services supervisor. That is a supervisor position. And then we've got a coordinator of transportation, which is a coordinator level. And then the Melinda Fiero, which is the coordinator of assessment, that is a coordinator position. The rest of them are not coordinator positions.
And not to micromanage, because that's not the job of the board, but just because if you look at the increase in 4 years of no matter what the positions are, but because the increase in 4 years was so large, was $1.4 million. And if you go through some of the salaries individually, the largest one individual had a salary increase in 4 years of 43%. And if you go through, some of them are rather large. So because that happened, and it didn't seem like because of where we are right now, we don't have the money for that it's not a luxury we can afford. It seems like that's an obvious place to look for cuts.
Keep in mind, as you'll see in both of the charts that we provided, though, a majority of those costs are board-approved, the contract parameters and the increases that were given through contracts.
Right.
So that's where the majority of those increases came in.
Right, but they did come in, and so,
Correct.
I mean, that's the thing is that, you know, if I have a budget in my house and I've done something that later it looks like I can't afford, I have to cut somewhere. So I'm
Agreed.
just saying that looks like a logical place for me.
Shelley, I think.
Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Well, no, I just had a procedural question, which maybe we can talk about. If we could just start with the list of considerations for today and then bring it back, or if we want to have a discussion about each thing as we go. But it might be more fruitful to list out what we'd like more information on and
Or
then,
where we want to concentrate our conversation on. And rather than go through those events individually and then you go to another, is to come up with a list of what we want to push further or talk about further. Maybe we'll do that first, see how big that list gets. And then after we've done that, decide if we want to pursue that today or go back to the administration for further consideration.
I think one of the things too that you'll want to consider, and I certainly appreciate, you know, what you're saying, Director Weisberg, about the what seems to be an increase for administration. I would just like to, if you, I think one of the first decisions that you need to make, and obviously you need to have a conversation with us at a board table and make the final decision, but we need to have a ballpark of where you want to be. If you want the full, if you don't want to use the fund balance, AKA savings, for any of these pieces, if we go to the 1.8 million, it will require you to look at programs. It will require you to look at gifted and talented and EL and music and all the things we do, because you won't have enough money to get, you'll maybe be able to get to about 800,000, but that extra million, you are going to have conversations about programming.
Mark?
Well, my question was just back to the board-approved contract. Could you explain a little bit what that means, that the increases have been the result of board-approved contract measures?
Sure, those are as a result, so there's a couple things. So when you see the director one, the board meeting earlier in the year, in December, that one included, when Denise came on board, the board approved 200,000. And then when Tom Nelson was here, there were additional reductions that were made to pay for the restructure and the addition of those administration. On top of that, then you have the board contract parameters that were set when, in the closed sessions, where the board said, here's your parameters for negotiations. So those dollars are the numbers that came from the base costings when we did those rounds of negotiations.
Shelley?
so that's maybe where I need more clarification, because I think we approved whatever it was, 1.5% or whatever. So I don't know if it's a combination, we talked about this a little bit before, if it's a combination of the 1.5% and the getting to average and something else, because the percentages, you know, when we see these percentages, it is confusing why it seems like it's jumped a lot, so we might need more clarification around
Sure.
that.
I think the bigger year, part of the problem or the result that we have is, if you remember, not this past contract, but the contract before, the first year of the contract, we got everyone to average of the salary comparisons of our 7 comparison districts. That was a year where we had to take some big jumps to get people to the averages. So that may be why this one looks large, because that year we had several positions that were way out of alignment with comparison. And we made some big adjustments that I think I reported to the board. Some of them were 13% to get there. And then the second round, we did do 1.5% on all the contracts. So that's what the parameters.
And Kathy, it would seem, and correct me, you know, if I err, I think part of the issue here is those contracts have been negotiated and they run out. So you really cannot, at this point, reduce those contracted amounts. What you can do, and that's, whether you want to do it or not, that's another issue. You can reduce the number of positions, but then somewhere along the line, if you do the latter, people have to assume additional responsibilities, or you cut certain things that you're doing right now. Is that accurate?
That's accurate, and I think there's different ways. So if the board is saying you want to cut $750,000, what we would then have to do is go back and decide how do we address those. For example, you could have somebody that works, instead of 8 hours a day, works 6 hours a day, and that would reduce salaries. So there's different ways of getting to that number once we know that, and where can we make adjustments or changes across different areas, for example, where we might combine 2 people's duties into one and get rid of one to try to cover 2 areas with 1 person. So those are the kinds of changes we would look at to try to adjust.
And possibly going on, and you may not want to do that, that's a collective board decision. Perhaps in areas where across the board you said everybody's going to get a 2% raise, or everybody's going to get a 1% raise, or whatever the variance was, another approach that could be taken is this group is going to get 2%, another group's going to get less than that because, and whatever that because turns out to be. But I think what both Kathy and I are doing is to tell you what your options are.
Mm-hmm.
Tina?
I think I would like to explore, not saying I want to go there, but just for knowledge coming into it. About a year ago, I asked for a list of programs we do and to see how much they cost, maybe what's allocated to them and what their spend actually is. If we could just get a list to see what we have and whether, you know, just to start getting knowledge as to what we're actually doing. And then there was a second part. I was going through the info that I requested a little bit in travel and conference, and mileage reimbursements are really, really high. We seem to utilize that a lot. What do we have? Is that within a contract that we have to pay? What do we pay for mileage reimbursement? And then I guess let's start there.
The IRS declared is what we pay for mileage. So it
58?
just went up to 58 now this
Okay.
year. Mhm.
Okay. Now, is that something we have to pay 58? Can we pay less?
No, but we could ask for less. I mean, we could look at less traveling, but a lot of it is our specialists, things like that.
Well, there
right?
was a lot of,
Mhm.
there's a lot of traveling, there's a lot of out-of-state conferences, and I think maybe we need to, or if we could, maybe look at slowing that down a little bit until we, not saying forever, but just until we get things in order.
The one thing I think, though, that's important to do, and Kristen can do this as well, but you need to separate traveling to conferences is different than when you're paying or reimbursing people for mileage.
Yeah, I think.
I think there'd be very few schools around that don't reimburse people for mileage.
Mhm.
Traveling to conferences, there's a lot more variance.
And the only other thing that I would say to that is, and we've already cut back on tons and tons of travel that people were doing in going into this year, but the
Okay.
other important piece of that is to understand that any of that travel was within the bounds of what was budgeted for that.
Mhm.
So it wasn't above and beyond what was budgeted. It all took place inside of that sandbox.
Uh-huh.
And so even by reducing it, it really has to be a decision more like what happened a couple board meetings ago, where we say professional development isn't going to, its
Right.
budget isn't going to be this much, and so then we have to look at reallocating, what are we going to spend that amount on?
And that was my question too, is if any of this money came out of what we've already reduced. The traveling, a couple of meetings back, you cut professional development.
That would come out of that budget. I mean, that money would be part of that
Okay.
Or next year.
Yes.
for next year.
Yep.
So just for clarification, the reimbursement for mileage is something that we don't have any choice. It's IRS rules and regulations. You can't ask staff to move between buildings and not pay for their mileage for that. And the second piece that you touched on a little bit is some of our contracts do have that staff are allowed to go to a national conference, and those are typically
And that's
not in Minnesota
Correct?
because of that's in their contract, right?
Okay, so there's things we can look at later.
You can. Mhm.
And I guess I would tend to agree with the approach of that Director Weisberg said, that if we can come to an understanding, we have to grapple with these very challenging issues of cutting the budget, but if we can come to a figure that the board can agree upon, then the hard job is left to the administration as to how to implement that dollar figure.
Right.
So whether that is conferences or something else that they're looking at, I would tend to prefer from a board perspective to say, this is an area we see where we want cuts to be made. Now, you figure out the hard part, which is
Oh, I
how to
agree.
make that happen.
I agree.
Shelley?
So would it be better for us then to talk about an amount and then give that back to admin? And
Yes.
So,
so do you want to start a number?
yeah, but what I hear you say, and perhaps we could add that to our list, or our list to be talked about, is out-of-state conventions or conferences would be added to the list? Is that?
All of those things are great ideas. I would just, when you start looking at this, you'll see that's not, when you're looking at $1.8 million, that's not going to get you near enough where you need to be. So the conversation, when we bring back, you will need to dig back into those program pieces because you won't find enough of the small little pockets that seem easy to cut. So just to remember that.
Some might call it the low-hanging fruit.
We are very, getting,
That's been picked.
Sarah's looking too.
Yeah, hi. So a couple thoughts I've had. I remember a meeting before I came onto the board, January of 2016, where there was approximately $11 million surplus in the budget. And I remember the board at that time had a conversation about what they wanted to do with those extra funds. And I think some increases in technology and some increases of staff at the high school were implemented at that time to reduce class sizes. But that was in January of 2016, so not very long ago. And here we find ourselves in a much different situation. And I guess one of the things that's been kind of gnawing at me for a while is, what has changed since then and now? What kinds of programs or initiatives have we implemented between, that period of time? And maybe those are the things that we need to be looking at to see if those are things that we can maybe freeze or put on hold, or are they working? But the other piece of this for me is just, it's just clear the board really hasn't had that big of a role in developing these budgets in the past. And we've had a bunch of budgets in a row that were deficit spending. I think as a board collectively, I'm speaking for myself, but I think everyone else is similar thought that we're not comfortable with deficit budgets. And I'm sensing from other people's comments that we really do want to get back up to this 5% fund balance. We want to be responsible with our finances. We need to get back up to that policy level of 5%. And we need to keep holding the line on not having any deficit budgets. I just think that's what we need to do. So I'm looking at this last sheet of this presentation. I mean, spending down the fund balance, and at least in my opinion, that's not an option. Cutting it just by 735, that's not an option. So I think, at least for me, I think we need to dig in and figure out how we're going to get to that additional level of cuts.
So So Sarah, for your question, I think there are a couple of things that we have shared with the board. What has changed? We were pretty clear 16, 18 months ago that what's changed is the contracts. And when we went in, we had shared and reminded the board that with the grade configuration, with all of the new opportunities we're offering our students, the middle school model, moving the high school up to the ninth grade up to the high school, those had costs for extra staff to be able to deliver those models. Staff at the middle school for the wraparound team concept, the whole ninth grade pony team was another cost, and then the extra cost of transportation just to get those students all there, $750,000. Those are all accurate. We have the numbers to show that. So the changes, what's changed are our costs, and some of them, this isn't a surprise. And I hope we can get past that, because what we've been doing the past 18 months is trying to give the board lots of information on school finance, so, because we knew this time was coming. Those grade configurations, the mental health, student advocates, all of those pieces that we've supplied for our students are really good things for kids, but they do cost. And so I guess my perspective is a little bit more about how do we do the least damage, because you're going to find that the 1.8 million will get you down to very basics, where the things that have been built the last 3 years without deficit spending, we haven't been deficit spending the last 3 years before we made the contract changes, that will really impact kids.
Not true.
Well, it is true.
Every budget that I have seen since I came on the board was not a balanced budget. Every single one, both 2 preliminaries and 2 revised.
So that has been, you came on the board in January of 2016.
17.
Right, January of 2017. And it was that spring that we shared about the changes. So one of the things, remember, is that the savings or the reappropriation of the money from the consolidated schools, that first year, we kept the schools in session one more year, so we didn't start that reallocation of that money to the secondary, or not the secondary, but the grade configuration until after that. So I think, we can argue how we got here, where we got here. We have maybe different perspectives on that, but we are where we are. So I agree. We're trying as hard as we can as administration to help you see future and look ahead. But the big question is, how deep do you want to go?
Okay, Shelley.
Yeah, I hope we can lay that to rest, because we've shared before that we have different perspectives. Just when we made that decision to do contracts, the assumption for me, and I've said it before, because we say we shouldn't be surprised, but my assumption was that we would be brought a balanced budget then, where the admin would have looked at how do we adjust for that contract. So I think there's some just maybe misunderstanding that we walked in knowing that this was going to happen, but that for me, it wasn't the truth. We made the decision on contracts to pay our staff, which is wise. And then my assumption was that we would be brought the budget that was balanced then. So I think it's not, it feels sometimes like, well, you intentionally made that decision knowing what it was going to do, and then you act surprised. My surprise is that we weren't brought then an adjusted budget after voting for the contracts.
I just want to go on the record to say, and it's already on the record, that I sat in that meeting with a couple of you and told you, if we continue to go down the road we're going down, we're going to be at a crossroads. That's almost the exact verbiage I used in that meeting. And so yes, to put it at rest, would love to, because it really doesn't matter at this point. The fact is, we are where we are.
Right.
And the reason that we are where we are is because whether it's contracts or it's programming or it's new stuff that we did, that's what, all combined, it's got us in this spot where we got to figure out how do we retool this thing so that we can get back on track. I would simply make the argument that if nothing else, the contracts, all of them, was the last piece of this pie that put us over the edge. It just is. It's an inflationary piece, right? It happens every year. It goes up. And so I would agree. It doesn't do us any good to go back and forth about any of that. But we did have the conversation, and and unfortunately those are closed sessions at the time, and not everybody can hear them until they're done. But we had them, and it's one piece of the additional costs. And like Superintendent Pontrelli shared, just adding the PAC Center, which is a great thing. Moving that middle school, which we talked at length about, we knew was going to be more money to do that. The transportation, we knew that was going to be more money. All that stuff simply adds up. And it's kind of like Director Weisberg said, we get to that spot, like in your household budget, where you go, okay, we've done this, so we've got some really cool things, but now we've got to pare the whole pie back a little bit. It can't just be one area, because the cautionary thing I would say as we look through this that you really have to grapple with is, it isn't just a singular program. It isn't just your administration, because it all works together. I mean, you can't we can't be at a spot where we're just gonna decimate this area and and not anticipated that's gonna have impacts in other areas. We're gonna have to make sure that we're very thoughtful about what we cut back on.
Thank you. So, to be honest, I think every person at the table has made a valid comment. And I am actually an advocate of dipping, as much as I don't want to do that, dipping into the fund balance. And here's why: because we have been in a cycle for years and years and years where we get excited about a program, we implement it not all the way. Q-Comp is a shining example of that. And it's not quite what we wanted it to be. It's not quite what it needs to be, because we have to try to be some sort of fiscally conscious about it. And then it doesn't perform the way it could perform. It doesn't become robust enough. And now we cut it. And now it goes away. And that is unacceptable. We have been doing this for years and years and years. And I would like to challenge the rest of my board members, as well as myself, to stop thinking about the ticky-tacky little things. Think bigger picture, 20,000-foot level. On a macro level, what are we doing wrong? And what can we do better?
I would like to go back to what Bob said when he said that the contractor, not what maybe caused it, but was the tipping point, because a lot of the teachers that I've talked to are very upset that they basically keep getting blamed for the deficit that we're in. And several people in the last meeting were watch the tape, who voted, who didn't vote. And I think that they deserved that raise, and that to continue to put them in the position where you're basically saying it's your fault we're in this deficit is unfair.
Mark?
I guess my only comment is I don't think that anybody is placing all the blame on
That's how a lot of them
that.
feel.
And it's unfortunate that they feel that way. We're all in this together, and so I think we just have to be as creative as we can to address the challenge that we have.
One of the things I would say, and I've talked about this before, and again, this goes back a little bit in time. Sometimes there are structural things that occur that affect you years after. Like, for example, and I've been on the board 10 years, so I'm saying structurally, 2007, I think everybody knows that we had a recession. And one of the good things, if there's good things that come out of a recession, is that part of the presidential attack on that was to supply money to schools, get people back to work, get spending, and all of those multiplier effects, but not only to pump more money into schools, but at the same time to do things that were worthwhile. And so at that particular time period, one of the things that happened with the stimulus money that we got, the good news is we got things like student advocates. We got things like reading interventionists. We got things like math interventionists. The student advocates could be school psychologists, or they could be guidance counselors, or they could be social workers. Now, play that out. For 3 years, you got that additional stimulus. Okay, the period of time ends. The funds run out. At the end of that, the question becomes, okay, the money's not coming in anymore. So what are we going to do? What you can do is to say, well, it's simple. We're going to just go back. We're going to get rid of student advocates. We're going to get rid of guidance counselors and all of those wonderful services. In the meanwhile, parents, kids, teachers, others see the benefits of a lot of those programs. And so as a result, what's always tough for an administrative staff is what do we keep now and what don't we keep? But what it does do is it puts you behind. And no matter what you do, and the hard part on education a lot of times, and new teachers come in or new administrators come in, people come into what's already a moving train. and they remember the block they experience. I'm saying that's one example, without blaming anybody, that you say these kinds of things occur structurally, but in terms of feeling, oftentimes when I was a teacher and I was in a classroom for 18 years, I was concentrating on what I was doing with my kids and my lessons in that tomorrow. I could tell you when staff members were laid off or that sort of thing. I didn't always know why, but realized there are some problems. One of the things, part of our structure too, and it's, people say, will it ever go away? Are we ever gonna have the good times? Every 2 years, we have elections. Members of each house come and go. The governor's office changes. School board members, there's an election every 2 years. And so what happens in all of that is there's some juggling, and until you establish a new equilibrium. And I'm saying that's part of what we're going on. But I also like, and I think that's where we may want to concentrate our efforts, and I would prefer, what are we gonna do now versus, yeah, but you didn't do this or you didn't do that.
I just have, oh, sorry, just kind of quick throw this out. Would it be possible for us to say as a board, you know, we want to cut, we want to ask every department to cut like 1% or whatever out of their own sort of, I'm not even sure how the budget gets developed. I mean, I assume there are departments that department heads who kind of decide, you know, where all the spending is going to go within their department. I mean, can't we just say across the board, we need to do 1% cut? I mean, is that unreasonable? Can somebody speak to that a little bit?
I can speak to it, Sarah.
Okay.
Oh, I'm getting feedback. So if you were to look in define a department, so if you were to say, you know, just take a percentage, I would say, you know, when you look at, let's just say a building or like the elementary principals, they each have their site. And if you say 1%, now you have staffing involved and you have section sizes involved and you have things that they don't control. The board determination on how that plays out is controlled. So now it becomes more finite. Now it becomes, okay, they really can control their building supply budget, which has already been adjusted, and their capital budget, which has already been adjusted. It's kind of what they control. Now, do they have an opportunity? Maybe, and there's still a design setup as far as, well, it's staffing allocation, whether it's licensed staff like teachers or it's staffing allocation when you look at clerical support or what have you. That gets changed at a different level. Now, if you were to look and just say, you know, Kristen, adjust your adjust your operations. Yes, that's already been in play. We've actually adjusted more than that. So part of it depends on the ability of that department to be able just to unilaterally make that decision. The other part is kind of to the disconnectedness of just those decisions. Like somebody might do something that actually impacts 3 other departments, and you know, I mean, you might lose some intentionality behind that. That would be my caution.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No. Can you say, you know, this, and this, go back and, but again, then I would say it might be more advantageous, again, back to give a number and have us figure out how that looks, because we kind of know how where the chains are in the spider web and what the impact of that is going to be.
Right. Right. I think I was thinking about something Mark, our Director Burns had said before, and also I think Director Moen, Kathy said earlier, you know, kind of thinking about it that way. I don't know. Thank you for clarifying that.
Director?
Yeah, thank you, Chair Potajek. I wanted to speak to your comment about the teacher contracts, because I actually agree with you in that, very much in that when we were in those meetings, I think it all, I do think we have to look at the past actually to fix, to do better in the future. And when we were in those meetings, and Bob specifically and explicitly said we will have to make cuts, at the time I I didn't know what that looked like, and Director Stibble and I have talked about this quite a bit. And I guess I just think we're in such a, again, this is why I think because we got us in this spot, I do not want to cut programs, especially not the instructional coach component. And I think we need to, as we move forward thinking now, how does our budget and our budget decisions, how may or may that not, or may that impact things like contracts? The contracts are the biggest ticket item, and I agree that I absolutely loathe the idea that we're placing everything on that. The reality is that is the biggest dollar amount that we have to work with. So I think we need to have some, you know, high-level conversations about our process going forward.
So should we, at this point, I'm sorry, Director Potacek, say this is an amount we want for this category, this is an amount we want for this category, and then go from there, or what do we do?
I guess
Ideas?
I would still like to see information. I mean, I don't know the answers. I'm still learning. As I met with Denise yesterday, I kind of elaborated. I'm extremely detail-oriented, and I like the weeds. So for me to fully understand what we're getting into, I kind of need to understand what's underneath it a little bit.
Director Pearson?
So is my understanding, once we have a kind of ballpark figure, that you would bring us a list similar to the last list that we had, where it would have amounts, and whether it's programming or whatever it is, it would be a similar process.
Other thoughts? Director Burns?
My only one thought is, I know that the board in 2018 had a list that it was working from. Do we continue to look at that list any longer? Question.
So that's another possibility, to re-examine the list or go back.
Right.
Director Stivlin? Any
Oh,
comments?
I think maybe we can go back and review the list that we had from before, but I feel like we need to new ideas as well. I feel like we did already review a lot of what was on that list and either immediately took them off the table, or at least, put them way down on the list, and so that's why we haven't already cut them. To Director Pelletier's comments, I agree. I think that, we've said all along that we don't want to cut anything that would be very close to students' hearts and, that would impact direct student experiences. So music, at least for me personally, anything music is off the table, and tech is off the table. Anything that enhances the quality of learning experiences for our students should be, directly where students are directly being impacted, really should be off the table. So that means going back a step and looking at, some of the other systems and things that we have in play. But, yeah, I think what I'm hearing from this table is, as a board, we need to know more about how all of these things are impacting learning. And maybe it is best for us to just come up with a number and say, okay, here's the number we want to get to. Let's figure this out.
Okay.
Make a new list.
I agree.
Here's what I hear so far. And if I'm wrong, or if you want to resolve that issue first, and legitimately so, some of you have questioned it, and I think we started off that. Is 5% still the target?
It is for me.
Me too.
Me too.
Is there anybody who that's not still the target?
The target right now for this specific moment in time, it's my personal goal, but I think we all collectively have gotten us to this spot, so I think we need to take care of the situation with 5%, that being the overall goal going forward.
Okay, Shelley?
So I think piggybacking off of that, before we started with the total number and we only hit part of a number. So I think we'll answer that question ourselves maybe once we're brought
Well-
additional things and what we're willing to
Yeah.
cut and not cut.
See, what I'm thinking of is this, is first of all, we all got to come from a similar place. And so whether we go back to the beginning list and we go through, and any board member could do this, I'm suggesting this as one strategy. Anything that you want to revisit, including music or including administration or whatever it is, if you check under your name and say, I want that part of the discussion, or I want the list to go forward with. And we take it from that approach, and that becomes our next conversation. When we reconvene, this is what's on the list, and we can set up a date. Today, and I lose track, it's Friday, so we take about 2-3 days. We set a deadline and say, they'll give you a list, and anything that's on that list that you think should be on the discussion table, put a check next to it. And anything that's not on the list and you think should be, you're able to write it in. And then the administration will look at the whole list, and that will become our next discussion similar to this. But what we will need too is, and for some, and there's new members and maybe it's revisited, we've got to have common numbers, common information. And I'm saying, and Sarah, and I'm not attacking that or anybody, if you've got a sacred cow, that's going to be part of the discussion. And if several do and say, I just don't think that should be on the table there, you'll have an opportunity to make your case. Does that seem like a workable?
Thank you. I like the idea in general, but I guess I'm wondering about like timing. So are you suggesting we do this at another meeting and then come to a vote with this going forward, or what's the process
Yeah.
that
What
you're
I'm thinking
considering?
is this. Last time what we did is we had a list. We had questions on what that involved or what was in there. And then we went line by line and said, where was there a majority that said, keep it on the list, and those who didn't. Shelley?
So I agree, but I think where the last list started was with administration. So I think that would be wise for it to start there, and we can add things to the list.
What I'm
But I don't
thinking-
think it should mostly come from.
No,
the
but
list.
what I'm saying is this, if you've got a super list, and that's, it's, okay, which list are you talking about? Because we've seen several. And you want it added to the list for consideration, then we might start off with a lesser list than the big, long one. But I can flex on that. Bob?
Couple things. One, what might be easier for us, if you want us to come up with a list, is to have an idea collectively as the board, what you don't want us to go look at. That said, Sarah, I appreciate the music, art, and tech and the student experience, but with those things off the table, I'm not sure where we come up with $1.8 million, because there isn't $1 million in administration to cut. We aren't going to get there that way. There isn't that much. And then as we continue to look at things that are away from the classroom, the caution I would bring is, as we have these programs, to your point, it's one thing to have a program, it's also the stuff that's behind the scenes that's supporting the program. And if we cut all the supports of a program, we might as well not have the program. And the last thing that I would leave you with is, we're to that point where we're going to have to make some tough, and these are going to be heart-wrenching cuts if we're really going to try to get to the point where you've got that 5% balance. They just are, because the student experience is given by personnel, and the personnel is the costliest thing in the student's experience.
And part of what I'd say is this, and we probably can't say this enough, even that original list we came up with for $1 million or a little bit over, there's some flesh there.
There is.
And anything additionally we're going to do, there's some flesh. The hope would be, in the long run, we get a better handle on things, and we're slower to add than we are to delete.
And it might be worthwhile to resurrect some of those things that were on that list as well. and have a further discussion about them. But tell us, what are those things? Don't even go down the road of exploring this, because we're not even going to entertain it. That would be helpful for us to know, because otherwise we're going to bring you something that you're not wanting to spend time on anyways.
Sarah had.
Well, okay, I'm gonna probably make a bunch of people frustrated right now, but I mean, for me, instructional coaches is still on the table. I know we've gotten a lot of emails from a lot of really great, devoted instructors in our district who support this program and think it is doing amazing things, and I don't doubt them for a to have instructional coaches, but it is also extraordinarily expensive. And I would like to continue having instructional coaches be something that we look at in some form. I had suggested at one time that we remove all instructional coaches. If we did that, it would be close to $1 million savings. That's just my point of view.
Yeah.
I realize that everybody else has a lot of different point of views, and I'm flexible, and I want to know more about what we might.
I'll respond to the instructional coach thing. The instructional coaching money that's paid for out of the general fund, so it's paid for out of professional development dollars, which is the only thing that is relevant to this conversation, is $348,000. The rest of it is paid out of Q-Comp, and it's paid out of achievement and integration, both categorical. We talked about that earlier today. So it isn't, if we cut instructional coaching, it isn't going to save the budget $1 million. My question is, to the instructional coaching conversation, is the board willing to say we don't want program A, or, here's why I'm saying this, we've cut $250,000 out of the professional development budget. There's still enough money in the professional development budget to cover $348,000 worth of instructional coaching. Again, the sandbox is there. We would look at retooling other professional development stuff, but could keep the instructional coaches. I think that's what's getting missed in the instructional coach conversation is it's an expenditure it's an expenditure we are choosing to spend $348,000 out of our professional development allotment. The school board has already said, reduce your professional development by $250,000. We're doing that. If you say, get rid of instructional coaching, all you're saying is reduce your professional development by another $350,000 is what you're telling us. That's what gets complicated in that conversation, but we don't save $1 million.
Well, I think the question is that, what flexibilities would the QComp board have in using their funds, their funding for instructional coaches, if those funds were used in a different way, then that would be the other piece of it. Obviously, that would have to go through their process as well, if I understand correctly.
I guess my thought would...
Let me just do this if I can.
I was going to say, you might answer what.
Well, I think that to me, the question to ask is one about, if it's a question about instructional coaching, that's not really a budget question for this. You might as well just say, cut the professional development budget by $350,000 more, right? Because this is that whole, to what level of weeds are we going to get in? If you're telling me as the administrator that we want you to cut even more out of professional development, then I needed to decide what programming we're going to run or not run out of professional development. Even if we cut $350,000, I would have enough left in the professional development budget to continue to run instructional coaches if we as an administrative team said that is the most important thing we've got going, we're going to spend it on that, and we're going to do very, very little in other stuff. That's what we need to, I think, from the board to decide is, are you telling us what to cut, or are you telling us we got to cut this much, go figure it out? Because those are two very different directives.
But Mom, aren't those instructional coaches employees of the district? They're the district?
They are, but they're paid for, 5 of them are paid for out of categorical aid, so it doesn't impact your, it isn't applicable to the conversation of reducing our cost.
Obviously, categorical aid is important to keep in track of, but aren't there other things we can do with categorical aid?
I can't. But it doesn't
That's the
save
only
your,
thing we can do with it.
it doesn't save your general fund any money. You might do something else with it, but it has to fit in front of those, or inside of those confines of that category.
Shelley?
Right, well, that's why I feel like we need more information about how that might look. What options are there?
That goes back to, all right, so so all of this links, and you have to think of alignment, right? And if I bring you back up to 30,000-foot level, your job as a board is to approve a budget. And I understand wanting to know details and things under, and that's great, and I appreciate that. Then your next job is to look at your strategic plan and look at your portrait of a graduate and your world's best workforce and approve those. Our job as administration is to try to figure out the best way to get you there. And I think what we've been trying to tell you with the piece of Sarah, why are you, that is our role. Our role is to try, that's why you pay people who have been in the professional quite a while. Most of us around the table is to try to get you.
I think the concern that I have is that we're, as a board, being asked to make cuts to a budget that we really did not have a role in creating. And you just mentioned the strategic plan as though it was our strategic plan. We did not have a role in creating it. We really had very little to do with the creation of any of these things, and now we're responsible for them. So it's frustrating. It's just a little bit frustrating. And I think it goes back to the line of, you know, what is the board responsible for and what is administration responsible for? And I think these are things we can approve. That's why I'm frustrated.
Shelley?
Well, and just, I do have a question, but just to add to that, I do think part of the reason we're where we're at is maybe we haven't had enough details in the past. And so we can go back and forth all day about the contract conversation, but I think it was people's understandings of what would come out of that. And so I think maybe we didn't have enough details then. My question was regarded to Q comp. We've had and the reason I asked is because a couple of teachers have said, what about this? Is it true that if instructional coaches were eliminated from the Q comp, if the Q comp board went back and said, this is what we want to do, could they eliminate instructional coaches and then use PD dollars, so that would free up PD money in the general fund that could be used as general fund dollars in what we're trying to cut? Do you understand what I'm asking?
There's two steps to that. The Q comp plan, in order to continue to be approved by MDE, would have to, in that instance, still meet the requirements of the career ladders, would be the first question to answer. The second piece would be to ensure that, in my understanding of it, is that the dollars from the Q comp plan would not be used to supplant something that was there. And my last thing with that Q comp piece is, there is no guarantee the length of time that Q comp money is going to be there. So that, to me, that is not a great dollar to rely on for things that we're trying to do. And again, I go back to that's already in place. We can, to me, the question is, how much out of the professional development budget does the board really want us to cut? That's the question. That's the question. Because Sarah, to your question, I would say that the line between what the board job is and what my job is in this particular instance is, your job is to answer that question for me. How much do you want me to cut out of that budget? My job is to say, if this is what I have left, here's what is the most important on the programming side of the house for us to continue doing.
So to that point, because that brings up a good point, can we, when we're brought back more information, find out, we know that we're way above or whatever, the 2%, but find out exactly what that is.
Absolutely.
I think, don't know.
We have, I mean, I can give you exactly what we spend out of the professional development budget. That's what our committee, the district professional development committee, works on all of that. So we have it. But I can tell you this right now, I will continue to fight to do whatever I have to keep instructional coaching, because it's that valuable, until such time that it becomes lower on the importance list than something else that we've got going on our side of the house.
Just to speak a little bit about, because we're on the topic about instructional coaches, and I think it has merit and would hopefully provide some value to the table. I did take one of our instructional coaches up on her offer to shadow her at Andrea Schuler at the high school. And because I've said this before, I've had a lot of mixture of feelings about the program in general. And in 5 hours' time, we visited 7 different teachers. 3 of them were first or second year teachers. The rest of them were tenured teachers. And it was a myriad of opportunity. One of them were sit-down conversations, especially the newer teachers really had specific questions and challenges and struggles that they were facing. And they asked poignant questions, and I could tell that they felt really comfortable doing that. The tenured teachers, a couple of them, just wanted a second set of eyes in the classroom to say, what am I doing that's okay in your eyes? What am I doing that, where I could possibly improve? And then one of them, which is the one I got the most out of, was a physics teacher at the high school, and very tenured teacher, and he was working on a word wall. And Andrea, and I don't mean to speak poorly, she's not a physics gal, okay? And she admitted that. But what she is wickedly intelligent at is English. So he looked at her and said, how can I communicate to my students better? And she took her knowledge and thought about the big picture and gave him some ideas to put on his word wall. And I thought, oh my gosh, if that isn't the most invaluable piece, putting myself in the eyes of a teacher, and if I were in a room and just to have an outside perspective, a trusted outside perspective would be invaluable to me as a teacher. And that is a direct impact on the kids. And secondly, if we've already cut professional development. I talked to another teacher who's actually not huge on instructional coaches, but he said, well, okay, we've already cut our PD, and now you're gonna cut instructional coaching. And not only do we not have time to look at curriculum, and we've got to go out of the classroom and do that, but now we don't even have an instructional coach to help guide us. And that's another piece of the puzzle that they can provide. So I just think sometimes if we take the time to learn about a program before we gut it and decimate it, it can be invaluable, which is why, again, I think we created the situation. I want us to do better going forward, and I do not want to cut this program.
Director Burns?
And I guess the point that I want to raise or reemphasize that I said before is that, and I agree with Director Weisberg's original point, which is our job here is today, while we're here on a Friday afternoon, is to try to identify dollars. How do we get the dollars out of the existing spending to balance, to get back to 5%, whatever our goal is, but we're talking dollars. We need to attack the dollars. And it'd be my preference that if we can identify categories, be it professional development, be it administration, be it some other categories, that we say, this is the dollar amount that we are targeting, that we think that, can we come to something that can reach a solution? And in that way, it maybe gives the administration the flexibility to work with our targeted dollars of cut.
And again,
Mark, Mark, I appreciate you saying that. I agree with you completely. What would you say? What is your number? What's the dollar amount in your mind?
Well, I think my goal would be to get back to the 5% threshold.
Yeah, I agree, 100%.
But again, procedure-wise, I'm talking where we go from here. Sarah's made the point on instructional coaches. Others have talked about administration, and there may be some others. Anybody here, when we come back, can say, you know what, I'll listen to your case. You make it as best you can for keeping or not. And I think that's fair play. And then ultimately, we individually have to make a decision on each of those proposed items.
Mhm.
Director
like to-
Pearson.
Go ahead.
Whoop, I'm
Oh,
sorry.
go ahead,
We'll
Sean.
come back.
Sorry, so I, just procedurally again, if most of us can agree on a number, is it then that we give that number to administration with our ideas of what we'd like to be included as part of that list? And then they bring back to us what they have?
Let me see what they say. Okay. Denise?
What I was started to say earlier is, you know, the board's job, so maybe you don't like the current strategic plan, but we currently have our Portrait of a Graduate, which was approved by the board, and we have our World's Best Workforce, which is something that we are mandated to do by the legislature, and we've had a community come together. Those are your two driving things when you look at how your resources should be spent. So typically, your administration looks at that and says, all right, to be able to reach that goal, what do we think are the things that are most important to be able to get there? So when we go through this process, if you think that that's not your goal anymore, then we're going to have a really discombobulated system if we come and just make random cuts without having the conversation of what are we trying to achieve. If we're really about teaching and learning with kids, when you look at World's Best Workforce and then all those things that we've talked about for our students that we want, creativity, critical thinking, problem solving, all those kind of things, we have to have conversations about what these cuts might do and how they'll impact. Because some of them, for instance, I think one of the things that you hear us fighting so hard for the coaching program is because we are directly in the places where we're starting to see the results. Have we been able to fully realize the results yet? No, because this is really the first year where we've had coaching on that literacy program. We're in 4 months of it. And so we'll be able to see those results. I'm confident of that. But, you know, as from our principals, it was the #1 thing that they wanted us to keep to help with professional learning and accountability and growth. And it's the thing that we see making the biggest difference. We have really talented folks in those positions. So to be able to keep that learning moving forward, we feel like we need more time and are happy to bring results with you. The other piece is, I know that I hear from you, well, I've heard a few teachers, and I understand that some of you have colleagues and folks that you know, but we have a study that our SCA put out where we have 86% approval of that coaching program. And I know that, you know, our SCA president has sent you a letter in support of that program. That's why we're fighting for it so hard, because we feel like it is really effective and it'll help you get to the goals of the things that you want. The other piece that we shared with you is the document that we have that we put together, because I think Chair Pelletier shared a good thought, and others had with me also, about, well, we don't really know what instructional programming does. What is PD? What does it really mean? And if you look at the bottom, what we tried to do is tell the story a little bit about the things that you've heard over the last 2 years plus about the responsive classroom within our schools. The secondary or middle school is the developmental designs. That's really about creating a culture of welcoming and really trying to make connections with students so they feel welcome and have a respectful classroom and environment. We've talked to you a lot about BAR. Our 5D and instructional framework is an accountability framework. That's our professional development and evaluation. That's part of a state requirement, but our coaches help support our teachers with that. And I don't have to, I think we've had enough conversation about the following things below that that are really important. So just my one thing that I wanted to focus on is, as we go through this, if you as a board say that, and I haven't heard that from the board as a whole, but as a whole, if you say, you know, we want to revisit that strategic plan because that's not the direction we want anymore, then that should be #1 on your list to do, because otherwise all of the resource alignment that we're going to do isn't going to be aligned where you want to get with your goals.
Yeah, I was just gonna say on the instructional coach part of it, even if we had a number and said, okay, what if we want to reduce it by 500,000, where whatever fund it comes out of, however that ends up being, because I talked to teachers over the break too, and a lot of them were favorable. It doesn't seem like it's implemented equally in all the schools, which is just the nature of a program like that. But some people were super excited about it. Some people said, I don't know that I utilize it that much. Some people said if my principal maybe had less meetings and they could be the same resource that would function as an instructional coach. So instead of getting rid of the whole program, what if it was cut in half? Like, what would that be?
I think you'd get more responses, like some of the people told you, where it maybe isn't implemented the way it should be, because now you're splitting people, essentially you're splitting people between buildings is what
Right.
you're
I've talked to a
doing.
lot of different people,
Yeah.
a lot of different schools.
You could probably configure it differently. I think you're still to the spot where you're asking the same question is it a dollar amount or is it the program?
Mm-hmm.
If the board is saying we don't want instructional coaching, regardless of where it's paid out of, that's one thing. If the board is saying cut X amount of dollars, right, out of wherever, then that shifts the management side of it to the administration to make the decision of, we think that this is still a valuable enough program that we're gonna figure out how to do it. And we could get to the spot where we would say, maybe we only can do it halfway. So it's just two different questions to answer.
I think where we're at is this, and let me kind of sum that, and then I'll give anybody who wants to make a comment before I turn it over to Denise. But I think the whole idea is that if it wasn't that we were in this deficit or this shortfall, we wouldn't be here today. So in other words, I wouldn't be arguing, or others wouldn't be arguing, take this out or take that out. I mean, that's the backdrop for all of this. So no matter what shows up on those deductions, or they're not going to be there, or those programs are going to be taken off, it's not because we don't value them as much as we're trying to say we're trying to make up for the shortfall. Whether that would revisit or restart some down the line, I'm not sure. What I'd like to do now is two things. One, I want to kind of go around individually and say, is there anything to add before we close? And then I want to come back to Denise, and because I think it's important what she heard and what's the next step after everybody kind of said, this is where we're at this point. So let's go around the table. I'll start. We don't have to go in order. Somebody can say, okay, I'm going to get my 2 cents in, and then we'll come back to Denise, and she will say, this is what I heard, and this is what our next step will be. Does that sound acceptable or workable? Who would like to start off? Anybody?
Well,
Director Pearson.
I can start, but just to clarify, are we listing off kind of the things we want looked at, or just any final thoughts?
Take your pick.
Okay, I'm gonna list off because I think maybe it'll be
Okay.
helpful if they have, so,
Barb, try to capture those if you would. Or you can give them to her.
yeah, or that. So we talked about before just those administrative positions, so administration, professional development, programs. We didn't talk about today consulting, but just to look at that, again, how much we're using outside, not for the things we need to use consultants for, but just the extra consultants. And then the travel, which will be small, but just have that part of the conversation. That's it.
I'll go next.
Liz?
I'll go ahead and give numbers. I would like to reduce administrative expenses by $750,000. I'd like to reduce the instructional coach program by $500,000 or half. I would like to continue to reduce our reliance on outside consultants by $500,000.
Thank you.
Okay, I guess what I would like to, the categories, I'd like to look at the possibility of increasing the cut amount of administration. I'd like to look at what the professional development budget is, so that we have a better idea of what we have to work with there. And I'd also like to know timing. I recall that there was some discussion over if there are going to be positions looked at to be cut, when is our deadline? When do we need to make a final decision here? so that the administration can act as necessary.
Thank you.
Today. It was today, I
I
think.
thought it was January 31st was what we.
All of my things that have been on my mind have been discussed, and I think they're noted. The other thing I would like to say is that from this point of reductions, maybe we need to send something to community engagement to start a plan to grow enrollment, increase revenue.
It's almost the flip side. Thank you.
Want to go to Sarah, maybe?
Yeah, we
Sarah,
missed
you want to go
Sarah,
next, or do
sorry.
you want Jennifer
Yeah,
Pelletier?
I think I have said enough of the, at least for my points on my list. I just want to, we do need to get back up to, and I would welcome to have a new list of some additional suggestions from administration, suggestions of what we can consider. I agree, trying to keep these cuts as far away from the actual student experience is really, really critical, at least in my opinion.
All right, so I think, again, for me, the fund balance, what kind of numbers are palatable for that. I'm interested in the professional development only as a source of conversation. And I'm also interested in maybe looking at that list again. But again, I've said it now, this will be my third time. We need to get to a spot where we do not go halfway on initiating programs and then don't give them the chance to become the robust program that they deserve to be, and then cut them years down the road. That is not looking for sustainability, and that's the third time. I'll probably say it a couple more times.
Can I just?
Can I jump? Oh, go ahead.
You want to clarify, Sarah, or?
Oh, yeah. No, you can go ahead and clarify then. I just have another follow-up question I forgot.
Okay, I just wanted to clarify, Chair, Director Pelletier, the fund balance, what's palatable?
Well,
what do you want us
yeah,
to do
right.
with that? Are you,
I actually am interested in not, I am interested in utilizing the fund balance for the cuts.
so is the question perhaps if one of the emergencies that Director Hoheisel had talked about, if one of them or maybe a couple had happened, what would we need to have in there to help cover that? Would that help?
Now I'm confused.
I think she's just saying she's okay with the second
Yep,
option.
You're just making a statement.
And again, thank you. And again, for now, because I agree with the rest of my peers that that number is,
Yep.
we need to start hitting that number. So for this moment in time, that is what I'm interested in.
Thank you, thank you.
So can I just quick ask my question that I forgot? I think I heard you say, Denise, that you're starting to see some positive results from, I'm not sure if it was the instructional coaching or the new literacy program, or I'm not sure exactly what you're referring to, maybe both. Would there be some way that you could give us some insight on what you're seeing? And because I think ultimately, we're all trying to do what's best for our students, of
Right.
course. And so any information that we as a board can have that shows, wow, this is working,
Sure.
and here's how, and here's what it's doing, would be incredibly wonderful to hear.
Sure, we can do that. Thank you.
Okay.
Shelley?
Sorry, just one thing that I thought of before when you were talking about strategic plan, and I know a lot of us, we want to get to the point that we're dreaming instead of just like cutting. So I'm hoping that simultaneously we can do, maybe as part of the retreat, we can kind of talk about like what are our hopes and dreams, what do we want to see for this district? And I think that'll help us, it'll help you see more of our priorities, and we'll be able to move forward together.
You might need to have a weekend retreat. Your list is growing.
But not out of state.
But again, one of the problems you run
No
into
mileage.
is when people or programs are threatened, they will come and advocate. I've been in education, one form or another, all my life. There aren't a lot of years that, they talk years of plenty and then years of starvation. there's unfortunately more of those cut years, et cetera. Plus, I would say this always, advocate, advocate, advocate. And keep people informed and not just at the 11th hour. One of the things I commend my colleagues, board members, is what you're doing today, even putting something on the table, takes a certain amount of courage. Because you don't make instant friends when you say, gee, I'm gonna do it over here. So that takes courage. The point is, and I say it again and again, if we had our druthers, we wouldn't be here today. Here's the last areas, and these are somewhat, after a long year or many years in education, I'd say where I look that I think are less harmful or less threatening. One, and I've mentioned it before, is when positions come open, oftentimes unexpectedly. And whether it's teaching, which that won't work in most of those, but some it might. When any position comes open, re-examine that position, whether it's administrative, whether it's a director. I don't want to undo contracts, but there are opportunities sometimes to reassess. And to their credit, I know both our superintendent and our assistant superintendent mentioned a couple days ago to me, we're going to find out, visit another district, how you get by unless. So I'm saying they're making that effort as well, and we will urge them to continue that. The other thing I'd say this, and we mentioned conferences. In some conferences, I know this from my own experience and others, some conferences are built into contracts. When I was a curriculum director, part that I wanted in my contract is that every year, if I chose to, I could go to ASCD, which is Association for Supervision and Curriculum Development. That was important to keep me current. Now, that was built into my contract. But there are conferences sometimes people may come up with that aren't, and I'm saying, unfortunately, in these tight times, and I hope they don't last long, but they may, yeah, you got to look at more of those with, yeah, this year you got to give more rationale, or maybe this year you got to go without. The one that's mentioned, I think Shelley may have mentioned that as well, is outside consultants. And again, there are consultants, and I know because we've done some of that this week, that I'm saying we need them. But it's a hard sell, but you got to continually sell.
Can I ask a question on that? Because this has come up before with the consultants, so maybe have it again just a little bit, but are you referring to consultants like the entire blanket? Because I believe that, so no. Can you just elaborate on that?
What I mean is this, like for example, if we determine somewhere along the line as a board that we're gonna go out for a levy renewal, there are people who can scientifically, in quotation marks, go out, tap the community and say, where's the community at? Who's for us? What are we going to be up against? Sometimes it becomes a dollar amount. What does the survey tell us of what's the tipping point where you're more likely to pass or not? That's a consultant. I'm saying it's a wise investment if you're trying to renew something for $7 or $8 million that you spend $20,000 or double that amount to find out where the community's at. We all have our perceptions of the community, but it might be influenced and we might have some blind sides. That's how you might do it. We looked at, and Denise was kind enough to share that with us, about 3 or 4 pages of consultants. Some of those you have to bring in, and that's what makes that list. Some of it are more discretionary.
So is that the list that you're talking about bringing to the table again?
I think it's just an amount if we.
Yeah. And it's, again, they'll be the judge in some cases where those are discretionary, where we got to do it, and where we can do those in-house. But I'm saying in all of these things I'm mentioning, it's like more scrutiny. It's like more over the shoulder. And I think I think they'll be able to work with that kind of guideline.
I think
Another,
Denise wanted to say
I,
something.
what might be helpful is, we have that summary sheet, and then we have the thick, where you can see line by line, everyone.
Yeah.
It might be helpful for us to just, to give the board an increased understanding of what those are. Most of them that we probably actually have flexibility are with our teaching and learning. And with our cutting back on PD, that's gonna automatically happen, that we aren't gonna have people coming in to help support that. As we tried to share and lay out with an example with HR, there's not much you can cut there unless you want to increase the cost for the district. Similarly for our facilities and operations, but we're happy to go through and kind of talk through those to show you, here's, lead in the water. They'll come in and do that work for us much cheaper than if we had somebody on staff to be able to do that. So we are happy to go through so you have a good understanding. I think where you'll see the most flexibility is under the programming. And again, for many of those, it's an expenditure for us because we pay for it, but we also get funding from Partnership Plan and many other places to pay for that student programming. So that'll give you a little bit more of the details so you know what that looks like.
and the last one I would add to my list, and I'm going to turn it over to Denise and ask her to tell us what she heard. And that is to look close at administrative positions. But I'm not saying backwards. I want to look forward and say
Can I
going
just-
forward. Please.
Thank you, Mike. Something you just said sparked a question for me. I know that in the budget assumptions that we talked about at the very beginning, the assumption for enrollment was to stay the same at 8,300. I think we've had quite a few different conversations suggesting that we might be increasing, over the coming years. I wonder what the budget looks like with an assumed, like if we could find out, what if we increase by 25 students, 50 students, whatever, in a given year, how does that impact the total budget, all else remaining the same? Or, essentially, obviously there are expenses associated with having more students, but is that clear enough? Like, how does the increase in enrollment, is that something we could maybe explore a little bit?
I think Tina hinted at that as well.
Well, and I was just, and Kristen can probably answer this better, but because we were in the the finance committee was part of the budget committee, and some areas were more conservative in, because other areas we were less conservative in. So we could get nothing in state funding, and then so if we went high on enrollment and then high on state funding, and they both came in low, we'd be kind of in trouble. So we tried to go more conservative on some and less on others, so hopefully we'll balance out. So it'd be it'd be a bonus if we can get more students, but if we went much higher, I think the consensus of the group was we want to be careful about going much higher, just because we don't know where some of those other areas are gonna flesh out in the end.
Well, and
Right.
Director Stivlin, thank you, Shelley. That's exactly the conversation. I would say based on even numbers that we're seeing now, at least for 1920, and it would be fantastic if October 1, they're higher. That's why we do the revised budget and it looks better. I would say there could be some latitude in years 2 and 3. That absolutely, there might be variation on what we looked at, but Director Pearson's right that can we do it? We absolutely can. I'm saying there's nothing that's indicating there's going to be a significant variance year 1. But as you guys look out to the years 2 and 3 and the trajectory, and do we try to meet the fund balance goal this year versus, you might have more opportunity for that enrollment in years 2 and 3, and you're willing to pace it out. That's part of the discussion, and that's absolutely appropriate.
Yeah. Plus,
Okay.
I think I've
Yes,
heard it said a number of times, more students is a plus for us. So the more kids and parents that we can attract to our schools, now somewhere you get a tipping point, I'd rather have that problem, too many kids. I like more. Plus, I
Yes.
think we got the programs for them. Shelley?
I
think
agree.
you could get consensus on that one, Mike.
Yes.
Well, and one thing I want to commend the group. These are hard decisions, and I think you've been civil, and I think you've been respectful, and I thank you for that, and staff as well, because those are tough. Denise?
So a recap, I'm hearing that we want to move towards cutting the additional 1.8. And so we're going to take the pass list, so you just have that, and we're going to add, come back with more suggestions. And then Barb and I have both taken notes on everything that you've said about the consultants and looking at what we've done at travel. I think it'd be important to show you how much we've probably saved already this year from not going to many of the things that staff, and they have done that out of the goodness of their hearts, even though they know that they are allowed that in their contract. So we can come back with that information for you. And then also I heard from Sarah, if we can just show the initial results from the coaching data. The hard data would probably be for you to be able to look at your MCA reading results. We won't have those till spring, but there are a number of things that we have data from our literacy that we can show you as just one of the things that comes off the top of my head for the effectiveness of our coaches. So we're happy to do that.
Any parting words, comments, questions?
No, I would just like to say thank you to Kristen for being very explanatory on some of those things. Thank you.
Anybody else? Can I get a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor, please signify by saying aye and raising your right hand.
Aye.
Thanks, everybody.